Everyone from Amnesty to Reporters Without Borders to the Pope want Julian free.
Just to start this conversation between Jarrad and Stella, we were wondering, Stella, if you could tell us a bit about your journey from South Africa, having lived in multiple countries and then becoming a prominent lawyer and a human rights defender, and then joining Julian's legal team. So we're wondering if you could just tell us in your own words your journey throughout life.
Okay. Well, I was born in South Africa, but we didn't actually live in South Africa. My parents were working for the, my dad was working for the Swedish Development Agency. He's a town planner and an architect, rather. And my mom's a theater director. And so they went to Botswana in 1977 or 78, and I was born in 1983. And my parents lived in Southern Africa for a total of 14 years. But they're both artists, and my father's also a painter. And when they were in Botswana, they weren't part of the founding group, but they joined soon thereafter of a political artistic collective called Medu. And it was composed of mainly South African exiles, so people who were fleeing apartheid South Africa, intellectuals, writers, painters, etc. And this arts group had various units. My mom headed up the film unit and the theater unit. My father was in the poster making unit. And they, smuggled posters that you could have, poster silkscreen equipment, silkscreen poster equipment that you could smuggle in a briefcase into South Africa and that kind of thing. So it was a political activist group. And my parents left Botswana in 1985. I don't remember Botswana, but this was a really key formative moment for us as a family and for me into my adulthood as well, because this group of artists came to an abrupt end because South African security forces crossed the border into Botswana and killed 12 people. They were targeting the members of the group because they were political activists that were active against the apartheid. And they killed 12 people, including one child. And one of these people who were gunned down was a very close friend to the family. His name was Tammy Mniele, and he was an extraordinary artist. And so my parents our family was obviously very scarred by this episode. And my parents were already anti-apartheid activists, but this is, a really significant part in our family history. Then we moved to Lesotho, and I was 8 when we left Lesotho. We went to Sweden for 7 years, and then to Spain, and then I came to the UK to start university. I studied law and politics. I went to East Timor for almost a year, and that was, in the beginning, quite a peaceful period. Then towards the end, it became, it was 2006. So the country was on the brink of civil war. It was a very violent moment, and I was there for about 3 months during this time. And then I came back to the UK to do my master's, and then qualified as a lawyer, and then joined the legal team for Julian in 2011, and basically worked on both the extradition case at the time, which was in relation to Sweden. I spoke Swedish, etc. But really, the background, what was going on throughout all this time, was the U.S. investigation. And so I was involved in the international team that was trying to lift the curtain on what was actually going on. In 2013, for example, Julian filed a police report and explained how his laptop had gone missing from Stockholm airport when he left, his suitcase rather, which contained 2 encrypted laptops, but those encrypted laptops, for example, included submissions such as the Garani massacre video in Afghanistan, which has been lost, unfortunately, partly due to this episode, which all indications are that there was an operation in the Swedish airport to steal his property. And then when Julian was in the embassy, I was there all the time, and eventually Julian and I embarked on a romantic relationship, and we have 2 children. We got married in March last year.
Well, congratulations on the marriage and the budding family, of course. It's quite a fascinating history that you've lived, and certainly all over the planet. But I'd like to know a bit more about the sort of motivations of you going into law and politics and studying that formally. Like, I mean, you can infer from some of your life experiences, but I'd like to hear a bit more about like what you're internally thinking and like what you were hoping to get out of it, and maybe what change or impact you were looking to make on the world.
Well, I think I was a bit naive, perhaps, about how. Yes, I think you have to be a bit naive when you're young, otherwise, you might not get very far.
Aren't we all?
Well, I was just fascinated by how the potential of the tools of the law to transform society. I think, at a small scale, but I was more interested in kind of the fascinating cases that you encounter when you read the case law of the International Court of Justice. I mean, these are things that stories that you read in the newspaper, and then you have a forum where 2 countries are able to confront each other, and I find this very interesting. But then, so I suppose the intersection between law and politics has always fascinated me. And obviously, having grown up in a family that was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle and so on, I have a reference point of a movement of activism that resulted ultimately in the goal that everyone was trying to achieve, which was a democratic South Africa. But a lot was a high price was paid for that process, and a lot of things had to come together. And I guess I had that idealism that there was some kind of progression over time towards justice. That has come. I don't see things as linearly anymore, but that certainly was part of my my self perception of my role in the world, was to try to be part of this bigger push towards justice in whatever form that might take. I wasn't really a child of the internet, like Julian is, he was really ahead of his time in that sense. I remember when I first encountered the internet, I thought, oh, I don't really understand it, and it will probably pass. It's just a fad, and like my very like 97 or something like this. I found it quite scary. So I became educated through WikiLeaks. Really, that was my.
Right.
So I was born in 1983, and I think it's a lot of people my age still are. They're just on the other side of the kind of coming of age of the internet, I think. Many of my contemporaries are completely not out off the internet, but really don't are a lot less immersed than people say 5 years younger. And what I did immediately recognize when WikiLeaks started publishing the Iraq war logs and collateral murder and so on was how it was a total game changer. And for me, I didn't really see it from a journalism perspective because that's not my area, or wasn't my area at the time so much. I didn't really, I didn't have a very sophisticated reading of the journalistic ecosystem. But I saw it as a political tool and as a legal tool to be absolutely game changing. And so that's where I think my political education as a adult really started.
Yes.
I suppose I was quite a politically engaged student. I mean, I wasn't really involved in student politics like that, but I followed things more or less. But I consider my political evolution to start basically from that point.
Yeah, right. Fascinating. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I think like so from when you're born in the sort of 5-year window, I come in around 1986. So I consider myself to be a child of an internet, and like Mendax or Julian or your husband was absolutely influential to me. I became aware of him through the sort of I think it was Milnet, in the mid-90s, and from there I got involved not involved, but became aware of it's like International Subversive magazine, and got into like I was like right on the edge of like the tail end of like phreaking, and managed to get like a hold of a bunch of telecom codes, went pit diving, and jumped into PABX systems. So and from there I got into the cypherpunk mailing list. So like from like 8 years old, like Julian has been this inspiration and like influence in my life. So yeah, it's a huge honor. But it sounds like we've talked a little bit about sort of this sort of idealism of youth, and now you see things in a bit more of a non-linear fashion. I was kind of curious, like how your thoughts have changed around, say, like law and politics, or like what is more non-linear about it, or like what is this sort of reality for you today? I mean, and to follow on with that, I think you've said in the past that extraditions are like 99% politics and like 1% law. So, and I wonder how you compare and contrast that with, say, like Sweden versus the
left human rights law over this case and gone into like white collar crime, because this case, it's an extremely political case. I mean, it's you couldn't get more political than this, and it really tests the justice system. And when you look at Julian's, the prosecution against Julian is a complete, it's like some exaggerated how to put it, I don't want to, it's just completely incredible. You would, if you put this, if you attempt this legal argument in a school paper or a university paper, you would fail. I'm talking about the U.S. prosecution against Julian. So the fact that none of the safeguards that are supposed to have protected him from this kind of arbitrary, vindictive, political prosecution have failed is indicates a catastrophic failure of the legal system, and so you can become very, very cynical about that. But I see it as a general breakdown of the international norm system that emerged from the Second World War. So if you look at WikiLeaks, WikiLeaks is actually a very, people don't like this term, but conservative project. It basically takes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and puts a practical, it's a project to make the Universal Declaration of Human Rights more easily enforceable. And the only way to do that is by freeing information, democratizing information, making the records of history available and readily deployable in international fora, for example, in the courts or in journalism or in academia, etc. It's solving the information asymmetry, which allows impunity. It allows lack of accountability and all these things. So if you level the information, if you make that information available to the people who need to evidence something in a court case or inform the course of history and so on, then you start leveling the playing field. So I think that's what is so threatening to those who aim towards less information. And what we've seen over time is increasingly not just less information available to the public, but an increase in the means through which those in power can restrict, manipulate, and make that information asymmetry even greater. At the point where WikiLeaks published the Iraq war logs, the Afghan war diaries, State Department cables, Guantanamo Bay, detainee assessment briefs, and collateral murder in 2010, this was kind of the internet at its highest potential. It was a kind of golden moment of the internet and of transparency was a good word. It wasn't a dirty word. You don't use that transparency anymore. I see that more and more with privacy. You don't see privacy talked about very much anymore. And so since 2010, and this tracks Julian's persecution, there was 1 or 2 years, or maybe you could drag it out until Edward Snowden. And then since then, there's been this massive counter attack on every front. And it's not just the will is there, because there's always probably been the will or to push back, but the means have become more sophisticated and more able to shut down that movement towards more openness. And I think there's also been the public feels less entitled to information too. So WikiLeaks came out of a culture in which the government should be open. You know, the decisions have to be accountable to the citizenship. That those who govern should always be governing with the assumption that what they're doing will be able to be monitored and held up to democratic scrutiny in some form. Whereas now I think the shift is, the default is that the state has secrecy as its default, and then it can disclose information more or less at its as it wishes, and that's a major shift. And so I think for people who are young now, I don't know if they're aware that that's a shift, because that's kind of become the default. It's very concerning. So that's why when you were talking about that's what I mean, that it's not linear. I've come to understand that that I experienced this internet at its strongest, or I guess, well, you or Julian would have really experienced it, but before it became a massive, ubiquitous thing, a free internet. I think I experienced more or less a free internet, and for many people who are younger than me, they've never experienced that, or they don't understand what the shift has been.
I think that's a correct assessment, as bleak as it is. And it's very much a fulfilled prophecy of like a lot of what the cypherpunks talked about, you know, in the sort of mid to late 90s. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. Like, you know, one of the things that comes to mind is like Ron Paul's quote, like, truth is treason in like the empire of lies. And like, my understanding of like, say, some of Julian's ideas is that he was, you know, concerned with like society as general and like how we could make better decisions collectively, and like how we can have just governments. And in particular, he was concerned with like, let's say, like historical or intellectual record, and how it could be manipulated, say, to rewrite history. And then became concerned, or it sounded like he became concerned through some of his essays, such as like Conspiracy as Governance, where he was concerned with, say, like certain actors that would set up like these networks of secrecy, and like they're, you know, he was viewing them as a social graph, and was trying to figure, like, basically, you know, in the same way that a hacker's mindset would like understand the system and then navigate it, or be able to modify it in some way. You know, to me, that he came across a method in which he could partition this sort of social graph of like conspirators or people who were looking to sort of modify the history and like and effectively implement unjust governance. And you know, some of the tools of that are certainly like mass surveillance and consequently censorship after it. And that's, and you know, that's kind of what the, you know, WikiLeaks was, at least in my understanding, was like, you know, one of these political tools, as you put it, that allowed you to kind of, using truth, bring us closer just governance, and allow us to collectively make better decisions, having a closer understanding of what reality was, and exposing, I guess, criminality in some ways, right? But not necessarily. Yeah. And yeah, I've certainly witnessed the internet transform into something that looks more like a feudal system these days, right? With and consolidated sort of big tech platforms, and a lot of the youth, like if they're on TikTok or something like that, are very unaware of the commercialization of this mass surveillance, and how they are manipulated psychologically through algorithms and these sort of things. So
on this, Jarrad, I just wanted us to perhaps for you to tell us a bit more about your journey from a successful entrepreneur, an internet entrepreneur, into a civil libertarian, into somebody who's dedicating his resources, his time, into a project which is very much grounded in privacy and free expression. And in doing so, I know you described your sort of early influences, finding out about Julian, and reading the book by Peter Ludlow, for example, as a teenager. I wanted just for you to sort of tell us a bit more as well about sort of that journey that's taken you in life as well.
I became aware of the cypherpunk movement around the age of 8, and then by those were certainly formative years, and I was steeped in that sort of culture. Certainly by the time I was 10, I started coding around a similar age as well, making beige boxes and these sort of things. And I didn't have anything of value to contribute at that age, apart from just kind of playing with these ideas and navigating these systems in ways that I could. But I was certainly consuming all the information, right? I became completely engrossed in what the cypherpunk message was, and understanding cryptography and how this could be used to enforce human rights, or I certainly care about civil liberties, and things like freedom of speech and the right to associate, and economic freedom, self-determination, and these sort of things. And in the sort of at the cypherpunk movement, and certainly the sort of around the 2000s, we all saw, that cyberspace could be an independent realm, or even a sovereign entity that could and that it would radically transform the nature of states at a fundamental level. And yeah, with that, I guess the main inspiration for me from that was sort of Barlow's Declaration of Independence in Cyberspace. But they came out with a book, Crypto-Anarchy, Cyberstates and Para-Utopias, which is a collection of essays edited by Peter Ludlow, that is just on this topic. And so then I got involved in I was aware of Hashcash, and then I kind of got more seriously involved in Bitcoin around 2010, 2011. And once I realized that, say, Bitcoin could secure value in a hostile environment, I had absolute conviction, and I guess I dedicated the rest of my life to try and work out these technologies. And I'll try and cut it a little bit short, but got into the Ethereum ecosystem because it had, in the early days, a strong sort of philosophy that Bitcoin had in terms of its politics, but it also generalized these sort of application layers. So you could do smart contracts, or we had these envisions of coder's law, which a lot of people don't hold as strongly anymore, but there is this capacity to create institutions that were corruption resistant, and censorship resistant, and you could then use this technology to create what was called a cyber state, or a virtual state, now called a network state, a new order, a cypherpunk state, where instead of trying to fundamentally change the system, instead you enter into competitive governance and you create a parallel system in which people can opt into these competing governing services anywhere on the planet, which is just incredible. Like if you wanted to deploy, say, like an arbitration service that had like common law, you could export common law to every country on the planet, or any stable institution. So yeah, and that's kind of my approach and where I want to take it. And the technology now has made this possible to kind of introduce like advances in packet routing and mixing on the network level, allows us to remove personhood from the actors who are participating in the network. And we can also do this in terms of the transaction content. We can make people blind to both the participants, but also the content that's flowing through the service network. And this is really important because it gives you this property of like political neutrality. And political neutrality is basically a prerequisite for civil liberties such as freedom of speech. But the byproduct of that is also if you are able to prevent political bias from entering into the system, then you also have an aspect or a byproduct of like sovereignty or autonomy of the system, and therefore you can terrorize cyberspace. At least that's the naive idealist idea, of youth.
That's not naive at all. Very interesting, very fascinating. On that, so Stella, I've heard how you've spoken about how Julian has introduced you to crypto, and we all know that Julian is a crypto native. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about how you were introduced, the conversations you had with Julian, what's Julian's thinking and idea and views about crypto, and obviously how sort of Wikileaks has started accepting crypto as donations?
Well, I won't even try to recreate Julian's views on crypto because I don't want to embarrass myself. But the way he introduced me, as I say, complete someone from the past century struggling with technology at the time. I think I've evolved since then. But when I first heard about crypto and mainly Bitcoin was in 2011. And in fact, Julian was in Norfolk at the time. He was under house arrest, and I think he was CTO or CEO, anyway, Eric Schmidt of Google asked to meet with Julian. And Julian accepted the meeting, and and so Eric Schmidt came with Jarrad Hope, who I don't know if he had been at the State Department, but was then Google, and another person. The three of them came to Norfolk, and I was at the lunch with this delegation from Google, and Google was writing a book at the time, and they wanted to interview Julian to understand his ideas about the internet. And so there was a very interesting conversation, and in fact, this conversation is recorded with the Eric Schmidt's permission, because the agreement was that they would share the recording, and then they could have a more relaxed, fluid conversation about technology and the internet and so on. And I mean, I was lost on for much of the conversation, I was lost. But it's a very interesting conversation because Julian introduces Eric Schmidt to Bitcoin at this conversation. And at this point, Eric Schmidt has not heard of Bitcoin. So I guess that's probably the first time I heard about Bitcoin. And then this was more or less when Occupy Wall Street was happening as well. And I just recall this conversation I had with Julian, where he was explaining, how cryptography could have a real world impact in, it was just so weird to me to understand how mathematics basically could have a real world impact, and that the universe conspires to make cryptography work, and that it can subvert, or it's more powerful than the nuclear bomb. So all of these things were completely new concepts to me, and he said, well, Bitcoin is the real Occupy Wall Street, and this kind of made it relatable for me. Okay, so this is something that that has the power to subvert the banking system in some fundamental way, that changes the rules of the game, right? And over time, I became more educated about both about the problems of the internet and the architecture of the internet, and how our, I learned how the internet wasn't just some big public square, but it was actually more like a terminal in which there are different, train companies that are privatized, and they take you from one place to the other, but you don't really know the route or what they're doing to you on the train, and what you're, sacrificing to get to where you're trying to go. So for Julian, he was, and WikiLeaks, it was really and is really about preserving reality, right? Preserving reality as the tools to manipulate and distort reality become more and more powerful. One of the, I think for the people who are trying to, expose surveillance and preserve privacy and fight censorship and all these things now, studying what happened to WikiLeaks now over a decade ago, how the authorities reacted, is really indicative. It's really useful, because it was kind of the first time that certain coercive measures were used. So, for example, with the banking blockade started within a couple of days of WikiLeaks publishing the U.S. State Department cables. So the cables were published on the 29th of November or 28th, depending on which country you were in. And by the 2nd of December, Bank of America, Visa, MasterCard, etc., had shut down donations to WikiLeaks. And this was effectively censorship through demonetization, or so they hoped. And it had never been done before. I mean, there was a lot of, it took everyone by surprise that this had happened. And it wasn't a legal measure, it was an extra legal measure. From what we hear, it was a couple of senators who called up their pals in these corporations, and then they shut it down, in a completely unaccountable way. There was a couple of court cases in Iceland, which WikiLeaks eventually won, that against a card processor in Iceland, and the Supreme Court of Iceland found that this just arbitrarily shutting down WikiLeaks from its donation stream was illegal, but it took years and years, and it was just Iceland, right? At the time, there was some pronouncement by the European Parliament as well. But now, of course, we've seen a normalization of this practice. where social media companies have just shut down content providers of content from their supporters and their audience and their livelihood. And yeah, it took 10 years, but this is now very, very normal, and it's part of a bigger censorship push. WikiLeaks survived because it adopted Bitcoin, basically, at that point where, well, it took a little while, and WikiLeaks had some reserves at that point because people had generously donated up until that point. And the donations were an average of $25. I mean, it wasn't huge donations. These were average people just sending small amounts. But that allowed WikiLeaks to continue for a few years and then eventually adopt Bitcoin or receive Bitcoin donations, which also allowed things to continue. So WikiLeaks is, I think, the first Bitcoin-powered project.
Yeah, I've certainly heard, Julian say Bitcoin is like the real Occupy movement. But what I also find fascinating is like the lead up, from Arab Springs, and I think WikiLeaks was shown to be an effective tool against the sort of authoritarian regimes in that sort of area, and like I was involved in that. I don't know what that experience was like from your side, or if you're involved or aware of it, but I'd love to hear a bit more about it.
Well, I was following it, and so this was a really interesting. I guess the comparison maybe is with the French Revolution, maybe. You had the revolutions in Tunisia and then Egypt, and the WikiLeaks publications about Tunisia and Egypt were really critical in having these revolutions, in kind of fueling the revolutions, really, because they provided the US State Department's internal conversations and communications about these corrupt regimes. And yeah, Amnesty International sort of credits WikiLeaks, I think, for the, being a major influence on at least Tunisia or maybe also Egypt. You also had like the Days of Rage, right? There was the US Days of Rage that eventually evolved into Occupy Wall Street, but the original Days of Rage were in Yemen. And I think the Tahrir Square in Egypt influenced or inspired the Spanish 15M movement, the Indignados, who then occupied the central square in Madrid. And this was really interesting to see how of course the context for all of this was the 2008 banking crisis, right? And then years of austerity, and well, it came quite quickly after, actually, now that I think of it. But that was the climate, and so I think the WikiLeaks publications captured that moment of democratic mobilization, and it's very interesting that that it seemed like it was there to stay at the time. That something fundamental was happening, and I guess it did. I mean, Occupy, people got educated with Occupy and went on to do interesting things. But I think there's been it was definitely a moment of kind of optimism and democratic celebration, I'd say. But then, I think what's happened with the crypto world has been very interesting, and that the more kind of sewn up the commercial internet becomes, the more there is a need for alternative systems and networks and modes of organizing. And there's also a greater demand for it. So you think about how bad, for example, censorship is now. It's become ubiquitous, normalized. I mean, even Glenn Greenwald was tweeting about this. Jordan Peterson did an interview with Robert Kennedy Jr., and it's been censored from YouTube. And you think, how is this possible? These are, first of all, you can make a very clear argument that this is election interference by YouTube. And these aren't marginal figures in the sense that they have, I wouldn't say they're mainstream, but mainstream has almost become the numbers in mainstream have become smaller and smaller. So these people have a big following, and they've been censored on YouTube, massive following. So, okay, what I'm getting to is that the demand for these alternative systems is greater because it's affecting not just normal people, but people who have some form of power, not the kind of power that doesn't get you censored, but who have the ability to galvanize lots of people into seeing the need for something else. And I think that's kind of I think it's a hopeful development. I mean, it's not a good context that it's become so generalized that but it's basically the censorship and the surveillance and so on is so generalized that it's kind of caving in on itself, or it's basically a fiefdom where, if we couple our rights as citizens to our presence on the internet, then we're not citizens really. We're just kind of I don't know what we are, but it's important that we don't couple our civil rights and liberties to how they're expressed on these social media websites or whatever. We need to also, I think, use what's there. I mean, if you look at Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, every person has the right to receive and impart and seek information, regardless of means, regardless of the medium. That's pretty solid, If we stick to this document from 1948, which everyone bought into, and everyone says, yes, this is right, this is binding, and so on. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just have to recognize how far we've departed from the agreed standard. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think Julian is kind of viewed censorship as an opportunity because it is a weakness in the system, right? And it tells you, it becomes a signal telling you, what is valuable. And And like the more that we start to see both, censorship on big tech platforms and social media, as well as economic censorship, which a lot of people in crypto face today, like just by, the bank saying that there's some kind of a fiat transaction associated with crypto, then like many of us have experienced like these account closures. But it just, to me, it gets worse before it gets better, I guess. And it just shows the inherent fragility in this system. If it has to do that, then it's not a strong system that they're trying to maintain.
I think we're moving into, we're in a very dangerous moment, because I think we're kind of moving into a not just post-national, but like kind of post-state system, right? You have the banks that are basically being forced into a position of surveilling the clients, whereas previously they were, they had some kind of secrecy of obligations towards the clients. Now they're a proxy for control and surveillance by the state. And then when you look at Julian's prosecution, I mean, the US is using extraterritorial interpretations of their domestic legislation in order to keep him imprisoned. I mean, they're applying the US Espionage Act to an Australian in the UK. And then not only that, they say because he's not American, he doesn't enjoy constitutional rights. And it's completely insane. And so the US has been using legal means to further their foreign policy objectives. You saw it with the way they tried to extradite and harassed the CFO. I think she was CFO of Huawei, and embroiled her for years in an extradition battle in Canada. And there's also the case of this Venezuelan diplomat Alex Saab, who was on a diplomatic mission to try to find partners to get Venezuela to be able to trade with other countries that they didn't have trading relationships with. Like it's, I think it's a new development where the U.S. government is using and abusing its criminal justice system or its laws to get allies and compliant governments to let them further those objectives, and that's a very bad development, because that's kind of the UK giving up its sovereignty if it allows the US to apply its laws extraterritorially. You also see this development in the agreements with NATO countries. So I think I was reading about Norway that I think has some NATO military base up north, and they've agreed to giving up jurisdiction in relation to certain matters that occur within that territory. And of course, the United States has always had these kind of status of forces agreements where there are military bases. You saw it in this case with Anne Sekulas, the CIA officer who was based in the UK. She was married to an NSA officer who was based here, and she ran over a teenage British boy on the road. He was on the motorbike. She was on the wrong side of the road, ran him over, and then basically got protected by the US government, was assisted to get back to the US. In the end, it was a high profile case, so she got basically, she had to do a remote, is a departure from what was before.
Do you have any ideas on like what the underlying cause or the reason for the shift in the behavior?
Well, I think
topic, but yeah.
in part it's that the Trump administration was more aggressive than before. But you know, I mean, I think there's a long history here. The so-called war on terror allowed for, well, it didn't allow, but the U.S. created a bunch of exceptions to the rules from invading Iraq without a Security Council agreement, just with its allies, to the establishment of black sites, and Guantanamo Bay is effectively like the most famous black site where constitutional protections don't apply, and you know, and you can, in the black sites and Guantanamo Bay, they institutionalized torture, and they found a legal justification for it. And well, if you do that, then it's not you know, even though they rolled back those policies under the Bush from the Bush administration under Obama, the Trump administration has used basically took things further and imposed sanctions on International Criminal Court prosecutors that were investigating U.S. involvement in international crimes in Afghanistan and so on. So there was kind of a more brazen attitude towards using its geopolitical might. But I think maybe the deeper consideration is that the United States is no longer the single superpower, right? And so it feels the need perhaps to be more aggressive in order to assert itself. And in doing so, is dismantling long established norms about how the international system works. So that's a great threat. You know, it's a great threat because, for example, the UN system. This is my reference point as, you know, coming out of the type of formation I had. That the UN system was a big deal. I know this isn't shared by many Americans, and I know it's not viewed this way generally necessarily, except for, you know, people who are really immersed in that kind of world, and NGOs and this kind of thing. But even the UN system is fast losing its influence, and that's very concerning because you don't have another effective forum, really, like, and that shouldn't be lost.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to sort of explore an avenue, which is, I suppose that's a question for both of you, for both Jarrad as well as for Stella. But what do you both think Julian's case means for all of us, the impact of it on our rights, on our liberties, the impact of the case on journalism, on activism, across the board? I'd be very interested to hear both of your perspectives on this.
Well, Julian's case is a departure from what came before. It's a departure from a consensus around being able to expose injustice, basically. Before Julian was arrested, if you think back to 2010, you had people, you would find this everywhere. No one's going to try to put Assange on trial. It's impossible, you know, it's never going to happen. He is paranoid, and if he were arrested, there would be a revolution. No one would tolerate it, and all these things. What's happened is that over time, just our civil liberties have just deteriorated across the board. And so what was probably politically difficult for the United States to do in 2010 at that point became possible through a series of active, you know, it didn't just happen. Julian was arrested as a result of a massive campaign on his reputation, legal, you know, financial, all these things at the same time, until it reached a point where they could pressure, the US government could pressure Ecuador, which had changed its government into one that was seeking an alliance with the United States, and so on, until a point where it became politically possible. But when it became politically possible, it also normalized putting journalists in prison for publishing the truth. And this is right after his arrest. I remember some commentary in the newspapers that was quite interesting. It said, oh, actually, Assange was right all this time. He was right, you know? And I think this was a realization where then people actually became scared. And that's the new reality. They're scared. It's not that Julian's case poses a risk to journalism. Julian's case is a current active signaling of intimidation to journalists right now. And it is shutting down a free and open society, because it is a reference point. And I encounter it all the time, you know, even just anecdotally. I was listening to a podcast the other day. It's called The Wind of Change, and it's about CIA cultural psychological operations during the Cold War and after. And I happened to be on the phone with Julian, and I was telling him how interesting this podcast was, and I was kind of playing it to him as I was listening. And then, so in this podcast, you have an investigative journalist trying to convince a source who is on the other side of the phone to talk about what they know. And then the source says, no, I can't do that. They'll destroy my life. I don't want to be Julian Assange. That's what's happening. You know, it's happening for sure. You have the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Guardian and so on publishing op-eds, not op-eds, editorials. So the editorial board is publishing, you know, the position of the paper, which is that the case has to be dropped because the chilling effect it is having on journalism, on investigative journalism. You see, they receive scoops, they receive leaks, and then they go to their legal departments and they said, what happens if we publish this? And their legal departments say, don't publish it. It's too big. Look at Julian Assange. They're going to try to put you in jail, or they're going to try to put the paper through a lot of very expensive litigation. Just don't publish it. It's too much trouble. And I was just speaking to Chris Hedges last week. He was in London, and he, of course, you know, he's had an incredible career as an investigative journalist. He used to be in the New York Times, working in their investigations department, and he still has friends there. And his friends at the New York Times tell him there are no investigations anymore. They've just stopped. Of course, they still publish because they get kind of authorized leaks that the authorities want out there, because obviously classified information is in the paper all the time. But if you publish something that is not an authorized leak, then you're in real trouble. And that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. So that's not the risk in the future. That's what's happening right now. So this is, to me, part of my frustration is that Julian's case is always treated like he's falling between the cracks. For example, he's an Australian in Britain, so he's not British, so it's not our problem. Or we're not the reason why the UK says we're not the reason why Julian has been in prison for 4 years and counting with no conviction. It's the US. The US doesn't agree to giving him bail, and so that's why he's in prison. Then the US says, we're not imprisoning him. He's in the UK. He's in a UK prison. And there's this false rhetoric about how it's kind of a wait and see what happens with Julian's case, because if he goes to the US, then it's a risk to journalism and so on. No, that's right now. It's that risk that some people warn about potentially happening if he is extradited. That is right here, right now, happening, and it has been for the past 13 years, arguably, because he's been persecuted and attacked, and in very sophisticated ways for well over a decade. And it was the failure of the press to critically analyze and show what was actually going on that enabled his continued persecution and eventually imprisonment. And I hope that's changing now, and that over the just the passage of time, the fact that he's in prison for doing nothing but publishing and exposing the crimes of the country that's trying to extradite him. I hope that people by now can see through the propaganda. But it's very problematic that he hasn't been freed. I mean, I say this, it sounds like I'm talking about from the perspective of that a whole lot of safeguards that are supposed to have made this completely impossible, including public scrutiny and media scrutiny, have just totally collapsed. And that's what explains Julian's continued imprisonment.
Jarrad, I was wondering if you wanted to share your views on the impact of the case against Julian, on specifically on technology, on innovation. You're a pioneer, you're an innovator. So I wanted to sort of hear your perspective on it as well, and how you see it.
It's just echoing more or less what Stella's laid out, right? There has been this erosion of civil liberties, the undermining of due process, and these safeguards that have been in place has put people into a position of not really understanding what system of law they're actually under, right? And there is no sort of and that becomes very difficult when it comes to, say, planning for the future at an individual level. if you are, living under the threat of like, potential persecution, whether you say a mean tweet, or, expose, criminality of states, right? Like, it's now kind of all on an equal level playing field as far as you as an individual is concerned. And for me, like, it's mostly concerning because I view civil liberties as part of a Western tradition or a great chain of thought that has been going on, that you could even trace back to, say, like ancient Greece. And now we're radically departing that into a completely different world. But it's not really a surprise to me either, right? Like, I mean, the cypherpunks in particular saw this. They knew it was coming. And it's just happening. It's just becoming a reality. And to your point, Stella, I think that people are starting to see through that propaganda, but at the same time, that propaganda works for a vast majority of people. And they start defending the system because they just repeat, like these sort of messages. And the thing that kind of concerns me is like, I think people do live in fear, but like they're also kind of adapted to it in many ways. Like it's like almost like a level of complacency and just going, okay, well, if I keep my head down and if I don't say anything, then like it's fine. And therefore it starts shaping like, your capacity to think. And like this digital panopticon is really far down the line in terms of its implementation. And I think, we are living on borrowed time, and I do think that there is hope, and like we can, the technologies that we work on, I think provide strong, I wouldn't say guarantees per se, but like a strong resistance to the rollout of this. Like, I mean, what's great about, say, like cryptography is it creates this computational barrier that goes so high that like even like the most disturbing technological process can't really go through that boundary. And once you have that, then you can create this sort of spaces for living like a human, and how we kind of view the world, I guess, prior to the internet's mass rollout.
I was wondering, Stella, if you wanted to give us a bit of an update about Julian's legal situation at this stage.
Well, Julian's legal situation is extremely precarious. It has the latest development is that a high court judge denied permission to appeal. That means that if that decision is maintained, then Julian won't even be able to bring his arguments about why he shouldn't be extradited to the High Court, which is the second level court. It's not even the Supreme Court. We're trying to get that decision overturned by a separate panel of 2 judges. If that attempt fails, then that is the end of the road here in the UK. There will be nothing else we can do. Obviously, Julian will try to apply to the European Court of Human Rights. He will try to get a stay on extradition. But as far as the UK is concerned, once domestic remedies have been exhausted, it will move to extradite him, and only a order from the European Court of Human Rights will be able to stop that process. I still have some hope that the UK courts will at least allow Julian to have his arguments heard. But I don't take that for granted at all, because I have seen, I've come to expect the unexpected in Julian's case. We have now extraordinary new evidence that has come out since the original decision that was not part of the extradition case, and that we want a court to be able to consider. For example, reports that Mike Pompeo discussed in the White House at the highest levels Julian's assassination, that Mike Pompeo, when he was CIA director, had ordered the CIA to elaborate sketches and options about how to kidnap and even assassinate Julian while he was in the embassy. These are reports by 3 national security journalists who are in the experienced with long established careers, who have no relationship or I'd say even sympathy towards Julian or WikiLeaks. They're just doing their jobs, and they interviewed over 30 sources at the CIA National Security Council who were serving under the Trump administration, who corroborated and informed these journalists about this fact. And Mike Pompeo has confirmed it by saying that the sources of the story should be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Obviously, that means that that the information was classified or considered national defense information, therefore they should be prosecuted. He wasn't saying that they should be prosecuted for anything else, for not telling the truth, but rather for disclosing information that was true. So how a British court can refuse to even consider these reports is it's quite extraordinary, right? Because it goes to it becomes a test of the independence and fairness of the British justice system if that report is put before it and they still extradite. I just part of this report was introduced at an earlier stage in the during the U.S. appeal, because the U.S. was allowed to appeal, and it wasn't presented in full because it had just come out at that point. But it was basically just brushed aside by the judges at that point. And Julian, in this appeal, wants to introduce that investigation in full, and has been denied, along with all the other arguments, which are extremely strong. For example, that his legal meetings were being recorded and transported to the United States, where his defense strategy was discussed and his legal privilege was violated. All these arguments on their own should stop this extradition in its tracks, but that hasn't happened. That's why I say that I'm not confident that that we will be successful in the British courts, and that means that Julian's extradition could be imminent. I mean, after the final decision, the next stage could be announced any time. We don't have a date for the hearing before these 2 separate judges, but it could be, it could be very soon. And once that happens, we don't know how quickly the UK government will move to extradite him. There are reports in the Daily Mail that they're already making preparations. So it's extremely precarious, and this is a it's a very serious departure from what's come before. It affects, for example, the UK press environment for sure. The decisions that the courts have taken in this case involve, the most serious exposures of state criminality that there has been in the history of journalism, and Julian is being punished for it.
Jarrad, do you have any points to add or any questions to ask Stella?
I guess like just one to kind of wrap up. A lot of the spotlight has been put on Julian specifically, right? But if he was here, I imagine that he wouldn't want to be the focus. I'm kind of curious, like, what do you think he would want to put the spotlight on?
Well, Julian is a lifelong activist for free speech, and I think that the course that the world has taken since his imprisonment has been pretty extreme, and I'm sure he would be very much involved in the censorship debate, and lending his expertise to try to fight this fundamental attack on everyone's ability to not just speak their mind, but also not have their message interfered with. So that would be my guess, that Julian would be very much involved in the censorship debate if he were free and in a healthy and safe environment.
Is it also okay to ask about how is he doing at the moment? How is he holding up?
Well, he's struggling, as anyone would be struggling in his position. He's been in a small cell for over 4 years and 3 months now, and he's having to fight for his life. This extradition to the United States is a fight for his survival. The U.S. wants to put him on trial, in a context in which he cannot mount a defense, where he faces 175 years for his publishing work, and he's doing it from this high security prison where he has no access to the internet, where the computer he has been given is issued by the Ministry of Justice, and so they've removed the text editing software and glued the keys down and filled in the USB slots with epoxy and so on, in order to even receive his the latest U.S. indictment, which was in 2021. The second superseding indictment was published on the internet, but Julian didn't receive it for another 10 days because it has to be sent as a physical copy to the prison and then processed and so on. So the entire world could read his indictment, but he couldn't. So imagine mounting a defense involving, allegations concerning, a decade ago, where you don't have access to your own ability to research or whatever, and having to do this in these extremely harsh circumstances. The prison conditions are very difficult. He's mostly in his cell for about 22 hours a day. He has to eat on his own in the cell because that's the standard in Belmarsh. His interactions with the outside world are minimal. He can receive visits from family and some friends. His phone calls, everything is monitored. The phone calls are recorded. He can only phone people who are on a pre-approved list by the prison, and those, as I said, they're monitored conversations. And this is something that he has been having to deal with and live through for many years, and it's hard it's hard on a day-to-day basis, but I think it also weighs on him and on us that we're robbed of years of our life, years of our lives together. I met Julian in 2011 when he was 39. He's 52 now. And when I met him, he was already under house arrest. He had already published the State Department cables. And for the past 4 years and 3 months, all my interactions with my husband have been in a big visiting hall for only an hour and a quarter at a time. This is, I was in my mid-30s when he was arrested, and now I'm 40. These kinds of things, they do weigh on you, apart from the day-to-day struggle. And of course, for Julian, that's much more intense because he's the one that's having to endure it physically and mentally.
Well, thank you, Stella. I can't imagine the sort of difficulty that Julian, yourself, and the rest of your family are going through. But one last very brief question. What should we do if I'm a concerned citizen in the UK or in Europe or elsewhere? Is there anything that we can do? Is there anything that we should do to help?
Yes, I have a free Assange Emergency Toolkit. I have a free Assange Emergency Toolkit, which I will pass on the URL to you, and that will be updated as time progresses. There's going to be various different actions, but obviously, depending on who you are or what who you know or what your circumstances are, there are different things that people can do. Obviously, if in a position to do so, donate to his legal defense or to the campaign. I'd encourage everyone who wants Julian free to actually physically show up to the protests. It's very important, and I think you also get something out of it personally, feeling the support for Julian, and it's important also for the cameras to see that Julian has a lot of support, including in this country. I mean, Julian has enormous support, I know, among the crypto community, in Latin America, in Europe, and also at high levels. I actually had a private audience with the Pope about 10 days ago. So, he has huge support, but it's important that it's not just online. And maybe the easiest thing, but perhaps the most important, is to talk to friends, family, colleagues, to keep Julian's case alive, and to not be afraid to express your outrage at this case. And it's not, it shouldn't be controversial, because everyone from Amnesty to Reporters Without Borders to the Pope want Julian free. So it shouldn't be controversial. And even if you want to say something controversial, whether it's about Julian or about anything else, you should say it. Let's not self-censor.